Hey, research method students, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and I am happy to let you know that this is really our last lecture of the semester. So I am recording this on April 23rd. This will come out on April 27th, and basically that's the week of April 27th to May 1st. The last week of classes, which starts from May 4th to May 8th, is our writing week. So I will not be presenting you with any new lecture materials. This is a really good time for you to work on your introduction drafts and your methods drafts. And get some time to get that work in, get feedback on your methods sections, which are due on the 30th. And really get that feedback that you need. So we're going to start talking about something that we will address to a greater extent in our next semester in the fall. But today we're going to talk about replication of psychology research. And this is where we're really going to leave things. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. And I thought since this was our last lecture that some extra special slides were kind of called for. So we're going to talk about different types of replication studies. So we're going to talk about the difference between a direct replication, a conceptual replication, and a replication and extension. We will talk about the replication crisis in psychology. We will talk about meta-analysis and external validity and what types of things or tests we need to do. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the different types of replication studies. So, for example, we can have what is called a direct replication. So a direct replication is basically what we are doing in the fall with Roediger and McDermott. We are trying to do the original study and follow that as closely as we can. Now, obviously, there are going to be some differences. We're not running this on the same population. I believe Roediger and McDermott collected their data at Rice University in Texas, which is a pretty well-known, pretty prestigious university down in Texas. Odds are pretty good that their participant population is probably going to look a little bit different from ours. And additionally, our stimuli are going to be read in a female voice, not a male voice, but it is in a sense a direct replication. We're trying to follow the original procedure as closely as possible. So, for example, your book talks a little bit about some work by Jones and colleagues, data you can actually see here. There is this finding that in general, we're pretty egocentric creatures. We tend to like it when people have we like people that have letters in their name that match letters in our name. We tend to like people more if they have the same birthdays as we do. And so Jones and colleagues basically wanted to do a direct replication of what is called the birthday similarity effect. And so what they did is they brought people into a research laboratory and basically made them read a personality profile of some random person. Now, at the top of the file was an ID number. This ID number either was random and didn't really match the birthday of the participant at all, or the ID number was a direct birthday match. So for example, my birthday is December 10th, and so if they wanted to do a birthday match for me, that ID number would be 1210. For example, if your birthday is July 4th, it would be 0704, things like that. And so basically, they went and looked through this personality profile, and they were asked a couple of different questions. So in the first study, it's basically a liking score that is on our y-axis. We have these two different replications. How much do you look forward to getting to know this person during the upcoming conversation? How much do you think you would like this person if you got to know them? And in general, what you can see is that compared to a control group that did not match the participant's birthday, people by and large liked these fake profiles of people better if the ID number in the corner actually matched their birthday, providing some evidence that yes, in fact, this is a direct replication of the birthday similarity effect, and also providing greater evidence that yes, we are in fact a very egocentric species. Now, something that's kind of related to this is a conceptual replication. So a direct replication is when you're trying to replicate as much of the original study as possible. You're never going to have a 100% match, but you can get it pretty close. Now, a conceptual replication is basically we are not necessarily doing a direct replication. We're looking at other types of, for example, behaviors that match ours. So maybe it's not just about first name similarity or last name similarity or birthday similarity. Maybe it could be something like the certain state that you live in. So for example, you could potentially find that people tend to live in states that have letters of their birthday in them. My sister and I, I have an M in my name. Maybe that's why I live in Missouri. My sister does not have an M in any of her names, not her first name, not her middle name, and not the last name she was born with. However, she does have a couple of C's, which might explain why she lives in California. My other sister does not have an M in her name, which is why she probably does not live in Missouri, but she does have an N in her name, quite a few N's, and that's why she might live in New York. So this idea is that if we can find that we like people who have similar names to us, or last names that are similar to ours, or birthdays that are similar to ours, maybe it would stand to reason that other things that we like living in a certain city or a certain state, or pursuing a particular career, or who you are attracted to could also be due to these things. So you can look at these aspects of this kind of similarity effect and see if they replicate to this overall overarching idea that because we're egotistical, we like things that are like us. So for example, your book talks about the idea that maybe people who are named Dennis are more likely to be dentists, or people who are named Lauren are more likely to be lawyers. And that you might find that Charles is very, very attracted to a Charlotte, for example. And so you can do a conceptual replication where you're not exactly trying to match the original study, but rather you're trying to get at these underlying ideas based on this overarching theory. If we like things that are similar to us and we find these, we can try to replicate that with these other similar conceptual ideas. So then we have a replication with extension. Now, in experimental psychology, and especially in cognitive psychology, we typically do not do one experiment studies. The only time we do that if we are looking at a sample like older adults or children or special needs populations that are really, really hard to collect data from and take some time. By and large, though, most of our research studies are multi-experiment studies, and they make use of a replication with extension. So this is the idea where we want to replicate our original findings, but we want to extend those findings and look at some new variables. So I mentioned we talk about replication more in the fall. We are also going to talk about this pen and laptop study more in the fall. So just to remind you, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about a study by Mueller and Oppenheimer in 2014. Students were either tasked to take notes on a TED Talk with longhand using a pen or with a laptop, and they found that later on when a test about certain concepts, so looking at conceptual stuff rather than really basic surface level questions, they found that the group that took notes longhand with pen actually had better conceptual memory performance than people with a laptop. So memory performance is worse with laptop notes. Now, you could ask yourself, why did this happen? Is it possible that there is something about a laptop that encourages verbatim transcription. So when I'm writing something and taking notes, I know that there's going to be a lag in time between when the person is talking and when I'm able to actually capture that. So because there's a huge lag between the person's talking and my writing, I'm going to have to consider how I'm going to write those notes. On the other hand, a laptop is really fast. It works very quickly. You can capture what somebody's saying really quickly. And because of that lack of lag, maybe that's more encouraging of a verbatim transcription. So Mueller and Oppenheimer basically did a couple of different follow-up studies that were basically designed to replicate the original study, but they took it a few steps further. So in the first experiment, what they did is they basically looked at 3 different experimental conditions. So they had the exact same setup. They're going to watch a TED Talk. They're going to get factual questions, and they're going to get these deeper, more thoughtful conceptual questions. And then after, and they were basically divided into 3 groups. So you have your basically functioning as your control group, basically being longhand. You have a group that were told to take notes with a laptop with no additional instructions. And you had a group in light peach that basically were told ahead of time, please don't write verbatim notes while you're typing on your laptop. Please try to put this in your own words. And it turns out that as the data show, here we're looking at a Z-score of performance. A negative Z-score means that they did worse. A positive score means that they did better. So you can kind of see that for our longhand group, they do very, very well on the factual questions and especially with the conceptual ones. But take a look at our laptop groups. So our group that is our basic standard laptop group that weren't warned, they are doing pretty poorly. They did everything verbatim, and it actually hurt their performance on the factual questions too, which is kind of surprising. But what's interesting is our laptop group that was warned. They're okay on the factual questions. They've got a Z-score of 0. But what's interesting is that they perform pretty poorly on the conceptual questions as well. So even when they're told not to do something verbatim, there's just something about a laptop that makes people want to write verbatim. And then they also did another follow-up study looking at whether or not people studied for these notes for a test a week later. So if you took notes verbatim and had an opportunity to study, would you actually do better? So again, we've got a factorial design. So we've got our longhand notes, our laptop notes. They either have a chance to study or no chance to study. And in general, the only group that did well was the longhand group that actually had a chance to study. So generally, when you're trying to take notes, if you're going to use a laptop, try to focus on not putting things in your own words. And it does look like, at least if you want to understand deeper theoretical questions, you should probably be taking notes with pen and paper or pencil and paper, because some of us are not pen people. I am a pencil person. So now we have to talk about something that has kind of been, at least for about the past 8 years since I've been out of graduate school and starting to teach more and more about research methods. This is always casting a very long shadow on the different studies that I talk about in general psychology and things like that. I just recently found out, for example, that the rubber hand phenomenon does not necessarily replicate very well. Dr. Teets told me that, and I said, good. I could never replicate it in class anyway. So we're finding more and more that these certain findings that we've taken as gospel from our general psychology classes, they don't hold up to further scrutiny. So we're going to talk a little bit about the replication crisis and maybe some good practices that we can do that you should think about if you want to do research in psychology. Sorry, I'm thirsty. So back in 2005, there was a pretty groundbreaking study. I was not aware of this study at the time. In 2005, I was just coming into graduate school, and I was just so happy and basically in love with psychology, and I still am. But there was a paper by Ioannidis back in 2005 that basically said that most research findings were false. And so, especially over time, and we'll talk about what really kind of spurred this on, but generally, there's been this assertion that kind of comes out every now and again that most psychology research findings are actually false. Are they? And it really depends on what you mean by most. Oh, where'd I go? Where'd I go? Am I there? Hello? Hello? Oh, there I am. Okay, so when we talk about most, this means a lot of different things. So back in 2008, probably one of the bigger frontrunners for looking for replication effects in psychology is Brian Nozick. He is basically one of the people that is really pushing forward with the Open Science Consortium. And in 2008, what he basically did is he tried to replicate 100 studies from 3 different very well-known psychology field journals. So they looked at Psych Science, which are psychological science, which is one of the more leading journals for psychology, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and then the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, which is actually where my doctoral dissertation was published. So they looked at 100 different studies from these 3 different journals to see if they could get the results at the same level that the researchers did. Basically, what they found is that and they did a really thorough job. They basically tried to replicate the original conditions of the studies as much as possible. They were in contact with the researchers who did the original study, and they basically found that out of the original 97 studies that reported significant findings, only about 35 of them replicated. And this very largely kind of depended on the journal, and to some extent, the replication crisis is not equal across different psychology fields, partially because of the different types of designs that are used by different fields. For example, social psychology is a lot more likely to emphasize things like between groups designs versus something like cognitive psychology, which uses more within groups designs. And what we do tend to find is that while both fields have studies that do not hold up, like cognitive psychology tends to replicate a little bit more. However, cognitive psychology also has, I believe, the second highest rate of questionable research practices in subfields. So this is not me going like, yeah, cognitive psychology is the best. We all have a lot of work to do. So that was what Open Science found. Now, Many Labs was a little bit different. So Many Labs is another kind of consortium, a group of researchers who are attempting to replicate different findings. So for example, Many Labs 2 is basically trying to replicate 28 different classic and contemporary findings, about 50% replicate compared to what was found with Open Science. So Many Labs has a better track record of replication compared to Open Science, and some findings do replicate, but in certain cases the effects aren't as big as reported or things like that. So regardless of whether you're looking at the Open Science findings or the Many Labs findings, here's what we know. Not all psychology findings replicate, and additionally, those that do typically don't find as big effects as was initially reported. Like the effect sizes aren't as large, the statistical effects aren't as large. And so there's a lot of questions as to why this happens. And in Ioannidis' original 2005 paper, he pointed to 3 different things that really make this an issue. First of all, selective publication. we'll talk about this some more. Basically, we tend to not publish replications. We don't think they're interesting. We look for innovation. And so because we don't publish replications and because we do not publish non-significant findings, only significant studies are going to be reported, and they are more likely to be fluky than not. Because we have this imperative to get statistical significance and have a p-value of 0.05, what we often tend to find is that people will engage in questionable research practices to try to basically get their statistics up and get that significance. We'll talk a little bit more about this phenomenon later, but this push to have this certain number means that people might engage in practices to reach that number that are not necessarily ethical. And additionally, science does not reward replication. Like, as we do it right now, you don't get grants by replicating findings. You do not get published by replicating findings. And because we have such a strong push for researchers to get grants and publish and get tenure, and tenure is predicated in a lot of places on publishing and getting grants, there's not really a strong push to replicate, which means more often than not, some findings that do not replicate get published because of a fluke statistical finding or because of questionable research practices. And when other people try to point out, hey, that finding's not real, they don't get published because A, nobody publishes replication studies, and B, they're not significant. Why would you publish that? So you can kind of see the mess we're in. And we'll talk some more about the extent of this mess in the next lecture.